In last week's video, I talked about societal norms. In other words, what society expects of us as women. So this week, I thought I would dive in and explore what they are and where they came from. I'm Gin Churchill, and I help women grow in confidence from the outside in and the inside out, using mindset, diet, exercise, supplements, and products so they can live their best life and feel amazing. In today's episode, I'm going to talk about 5 pivotal moments that took us from 100 years ago as women, not in the workplace at all really, to where we are now. I release a new video every week, so hit the subscribe button at the bottom if you don't want to miss out. Just over 100 years ago, women in the UK were not allowed to own property, they weren't allowed to have a bank account, they weren't allowed to drink in a public house unaccompanied, they couldn't serve on a jury, and they didn't have the right to vote. A woman's place was in the home, serving her husband, her family, or if single, serving her parents. So the first pivotal moment which changed the lives of women in the UK was the First World War breaking out in 1914. Suddenly, the economy needed women to work while the men went off to fight. They mainly worked as factory workers, cleaners, or police officers. Interestingly, they were paid around half the salary of a man who would do the same job. Second pivotal moment then was at the end of the First World War in 1918. The Representation of the People Act was passed, meaning women had the right to vote. However, there were conditions. You could vote as a woman if you A, owned property, and B, were over 30. The same legislation, however, removed the necessity for a man to own a property in order to vote, and they were also allowed to vote from the age of 21, so not quite equal there. It took another 10 years for voting rights to become equal through the Equal Franchise Act in 1928. But interestingly, women, I guess, traditionally hadn't taken much notice of politics. They were very, very much voting how their husband told them to, and that still happens to this day. In fact, I'll tell you a personal ditty. My husband and I vote differently in an election in the main, and my father tells me I'm cancelling out my husband's vote. What about he's cancelling mine out? I think we have an equal voice. So that's just one example of how one of these societal norms gets carried through the generations. My father wasn't even born in 1928, so he has never lived in a world where there wasn't equal rights for voting for men and for women, and yet he still believes my husband's vote is more powerful than mine. The Second World War in 1939 meant there was another need for women to enter the workforce. By 1943, 90% of single women and 80% of married women were working in some capacity. This time around, however, a lot of women joined the armed forces, including our late great Queen, who joined the armed forces and trained as a mechanic. Little known fact for you though, she was stationed right by Windsor Castle, and she would return home every night to sleep with her family rather than in the barracks. So the next pivotal moment was when Barbara Mandel became the first female newsreader on TV in 1955. Historically, it wasn't really considered that women were knowledgeable enough to be able to read the news. To this day, if you see a news programme or something similar being presented by a man and a woman, the man always sits to the left and the woman always sits to the right. The position on the left is called the anchor and considered to be the senior position. Women who take these roles are known as screen wives. So there's still work to be done, right? In 1968, 187 female Ford workers at Dagenham went on strike, requiring equal pay to their men. This ultimately led to the Equal Pay Act of 1970. It took till 1993 for all women to be eligible for statutory maternity leave. Can you imagine? This legislation protected women's pay, the accrual of holiday, right to return to work, and pay rises. And of course, we now have parental leave, which is brilliant because a family unit can decide who is in charge of going back to work and who is in charge of the family, and it can be split, which is just fantastic. Through all this legislation, however, there is still a huge amount of unconscious bias. There are still casual sexism and traditional assumptions flying around the place. In the course of my career, and not very long ago, by the way, I was told by somebody quite senior that it didn't matter if a woman got made redundant. It matters for men because they have to look after their wife and families. Just to put that into context for you, my corp job brings me 3 times the salary of my husband, so it's quite significant if I get made redundant. In the workplace, I've seen women not feel able to participate in male-dominated activities, and it makes them go small and quiet. They lose their voice. I've also seen working mothers who are completely guilt-ridden most of the time because at work they feel like their mind is on the children, and when they're children, they're not concentrating on their work, and it's a vicious cycle that helps no one. I see women judged by their appearance. If anybody remembers when Theresa May became Prime Minister, all anybody could talk about was her shoes. Did we ever talk about Tony Blair's shoes? I don't think we did. And there is still society expectations that a woman will take care of her family first and later in life, the parents. As women, we just take these on autopilot almost, because that's what society expects of us. So that's what we expect of ourselves. So there's still work to be done, but we have to be so grateful to our sisters and our brothers before us who paved the way and did what they did for us for today. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. As ever, your feedback keeps me real and helps me deliver the content that you want. So please comment below, and you have a great week.